I'm back, and I'm still a professor, so you know what that means. Remember last year? It's quiz time. First question, how many of you today are immigrants? Meaning you came to America from somewhere else and you're here to stay. You're not a tourist or something. So raise your hands. A few? Okay. 2. All right. Now, this one's a little tricky, but think about it. How many of you are descended from immigrants, people who came since the year 1950? So maybe your parents or your grandparents were immigrants. Not me, but raise your hands. Okay. Just a few of you. Okay. Now, in what period of American history did immigrants have the most impact demographically on the American population? Way in the back. 1910, okay. Wrong. But it's a good guess. Think about one of the readings today. Hint, hint. And I don't mean Ecclesiastes. Yeah, it was the 18th century. That was the period when the most people were either immigrants or descended from recent immigrants. Now, you have to be careful with that because in the very early colonial period, there's skewing. You can say the population increased by 100% as soon as the second man got off the boat at Jamestown. But what happens over time is that figure, the percentage, the proportions go down until about 1700. And then they start going up again dramatically because of the heavy immigration in the 18th century. And yes, it was heavier at the time Franklin wrote that essay and leading up to independence. It was heavier, and immigrants and recent descendants of recent immigrants made up a much larger proportion of the population. In fact, just a few of you raised your hands for since 1950. It was about half in 1776, half. We're not even close to that now, I can tell you, even though we all know immigration is really important and it's very heavy and prominent and controversial today. Okay, so I write books and articles about immigration in early America in a larger transatlantic context. And it turns out that free and forced mass immigration of diverse, hopeful, or exploited peoples under varied, sometimes desperate circumstances is not new to America. And neither is nativist prejudice connected to political interest, which attempts to stop or exploit immigration. Why do immigrants come? They come because of difficult, if not desperate, conditions at home. They come for the opportunity, land, jobs that are here. They come for freedom of various sorts, little government, low taxes, religious toleration, and freedom. There's a gender bias in this. What I just described in some ways favors men more than women. Sometimes, not always, women came because men were going. Parents, fathers, husbands, whatever. There were many forced migrants, convicts, and especially enslaved Africans in the early period. One way or another, these motives have been present in every era in American history. Force and freedom, hope and desperation, triumph and failure. So do not make the mistake of believing that in the old days, people immigrated for freedom, everyone welcomed them because back then they were the right kind of immigrants and all was well in the land of opportunity. No, immigration has always been a controversial, dangerous, hopeful, sometimes even triumphant enterprise in this country. Let me describe America in the long generation leading up to independence, when Franklin wrote his famous or infamous essay, and let's see how much of this seems familiar to you. Imagine a polarized America. Can you imagine that? Tensions everywhere. The potential for violence was high. In fact, violent conflict occasionally did break out. Now, these problems were in addition to all the numerous wars that took place with Native Americans and rival colonial powers. They had nothing to do with Britain or the impending imperial crisis that led to revolt, war, and independence. In fact, American society was going through an internal crisis. Americans against Americans, and immigrants played a central role. There were record numbers of immigrants pouring into the 13 colonies in the long generation before 1776. Nearly half were enslaved Africans of all sorts: Congo, Yoruba, Fon, many others. Immigrants after 1700, as I said, by 1776, made up about half of the population. Europeans, including Irish, Scots, Welsh, English, French, and the largest group, Germans, were there. Religious diversity was even more astounding, and it permanently altered the American cultural landscape in this period. Lutherans, Calvinists, Catholics, radical Protestants, Anabaptists, Quakers, Shakers, and others, and Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews. Africans included Muslims, Christians, numerous localist religions from the homelands, and newly developing Creole spiritualities. And in case you were wondering whether Africans imported on slave ships were immigrants, the answer is yes, they were. Forced immigrants, but immigrants nevertheless. Religious controversies were at the heart of this internal crisis, and they were connected to political tensions and increasing violence in American society. Immigrants brought new religious ways and contributed to the crisis. They contributed to the growing tension between religious freedom on the one hand and order, the desire for order during the so-called Great Awakening. Should Christian missionaries preach to Africans and African slaves? No, it's too dangerous. Later, the answer became yes. Or, should we give up our religion from our African homelands and accept the religion of our enslavers? The answer was no, initially, for a long time, and later it became yes, we will do that. Sometimes violent factional conflict within churches erupted that was connected to the new immigration. New ministers and parishioners challenged old authority. People were called out in the pulpit. I see our Reverend Scott is here. Imagine you're up here preaching one day. Don't anybody do this to me today. But somebody just stands up and just says, "What are you doing up there? You are not a child of God. You have no right to be there." People would say that in the middle of the service. That was happening a lot. So it led to a lot of factional conflict and tension within the church. So there was a fear that the old style of religion would be lost to disorder, and everything that native-born peoples had achieved would be lost. It was part of a cultural crisis of the period. Who are we? What are we supposed to be? It was all connected to questioning political authority and institutions as well. Sounds familiar. There were economic controversies. The demand for labor and settlers fueled both free European and forced African immigration. The extremely strong population growth that Franklin described in his essay led to land shortages and westward expansion and conquest, and with that, increasing tensions and violence with Native Americans in frontier areas and with Spanish and French colonial rivals. Immigrants flooded the labor pool, depressed wages, increased land prices that favored employers and speculators but hurt native-born Americans. Yet immigrants kept coming. Many succeeded, and many failed to do well in this society. There were cultural and political controversies. Many natives were alarmed at the assault on American culture that new mass immigration brought to the land. Others celebrated the increasing diversity, hope, opportunity, and freedom. Politicians, including Franklin, saw both opportunity and a threat from immigrants. And this came through the manipulation of votes. As the crisis developed, so did developing and accompanying violence and the threat of rebellion. All of this on the eve of the big one with Britain. Africans rebelled in South Carolina, enslaved Africans, in the largest slave revolt in the history of British North America. After that, the planter-controlled government banned imports of Africans on the slave ships because they perceived that Africans were more dangerous than people born enslaved in the colonies. Yet the profits were so large and the labor demand was so great that they soon changed their minds and the slave ships began arriving in Charleston Harbor again. In the 1750s, Irish and German settlers rebelled in western Pennsylvania, marched on Philadelphia, demanded that the pacifist Quaker government do more to defend the backcountry against Indian attacks, and they threw the corpses of settlers killed by Lenni Lenape onto the steps of the State House in order to dramatically make their case. In 1764, again in the Pennsylvania backcountry, Irish settlers rebelled. They butchered a small number of pacifist Christian Conestogas and then marched on to Philadelphia. And there they encountered our friend Benjamin Franklin, and behind him was standing a small army of armed sailors, dock workers, craftsmen, who said, "You're not coming into our city." And these guys meant business. So Franklin approached the rebels marching on the city, and he just said, "Hey guys, we saw what you could do with a small number of pacifist Indians. You really want to take on these guys? This is their city. Is that what you want?" And the rebels just said, "Well, well, all right, good point, fair enough." And they went home. 7 years later, in North Carolina, 1771, something similar happened. There was a rebellion. It involved many immigrants. It went on for years, and it was all moving toward a climatic conflict, a battle, in fact. And there were thousands of people involved. And the regulators, as they were called, were assembled. There were a couple of thousand of them. And the North Carolina militia came out to meet them. And the rebels called for Benjamin Franklin to come. They wanted him to mediate. But Franklin was on his way to Ireland. And even Philadelphia was a long ways away. He didn't come. At the last minute, one of their Quaker leaders just disappeared because he saw what was coming. And they fought a huge pitched battle with hundreds of casualties. The militia won. They were better armed, even though they were outnumbered. They hanged the leaders, and that was that. Thus, by 1776, recent immigrants and descendants had transformed America into an expanding, much more culturally diverse place with an exploding economy filled with paradoxes, whether the rest of the people liked it or not. The new country was born in war, following a long generation of cultural change, controversy, and violence, and immigrants were central to the story. One either embraced the change, put up with it, or left. Those were loyalists. Many of them had to leave after the Revolutionary War. But there was no turning back. Immigrant America, with all its hopes, dreams, and aspirations, as well as its travesties, controversies, and contradictions, had been born, and its fundamental elements remained and shaped American history and culture to this day. So, in the 19th and 20th centuries, in many ways, the same basic story continued, even as important changes did occur. The Revolution itself was a major turning point. Up until the American Revolution, the legal status of immigrants was overwhelmingly unfree. Enslaved Africans, convicts, indentured servants, free passengers who got off the ship and were literally free to do what they wanted, only made up about 25% of the total. That changed dramatically after the Revolution. In 1808, the government banned African slave imports and generally enforced the ban. There were many other changes in the mid-19th century. Catholic and Jewish immigrants began arriving by the millions, and Chinese immigrants as well on the West Coast. Not by the millions, but still significant numbers that you would see in California. And they changed America again, in spite of extreme nativist opposition. In the 1880s, beginning in the 1880s, massive industrial immigrants flooded labor pools in the United States, including Chicago. In the course of the 20th century, mass immigration shifted from Europeans to Asians and Latin Americans. And in the late 20th and 21st centuries, it's Latin American immigration has just dominated the scene in this country. Also, the number of illegal immigrants, numbers, and that as a political issue, has risen in the late 20th and 21st centuries. In some ways, that was like the 18th century because about half of the Germans who arrived were illegals. The origins and cultural characteristics of migrants changed, but the diversity, the nature of integration into American society or not, has remained more or less the same even among forced and free migrations. And political controversy and conflict has occurred in each generation. Anti-immigrant arguments have remained the same. Immigrants bring crime, depress wages, cause cultural change, and now we're really full. We can't take any more people. People have been saying that since Franklin, and they're saying it now. They've said it in every generation in between. So Franklin later deeply regretted what he had written about the Palatine Boers in 1751, and he regretted even more that he published it. In 1764, about a decade later, he was running for political office, and his opponents dug up the old essay, splashed it in the newspapers of the by then mostly German population of Pennsylvania, and it led to the worst political defeat of Franklin's career. But he learned from his mistakes and became much more tolerant of German and other non-English immigrants, and after the Revolution, he founded America's first abolitionist society. So here we are again, in the midst of another upsurge of diverse people coming for similar reasons. Last spring, UUSG guest speaker Diana Ortega-Erith told us about current immigrants coming, primarily from northern South America. I did not know that. It shifted from Mexico, Central America to northern South America, Venezuela, Colombia, overwhelmingly in recent years. What are they doing? They are seeking economic opportunity and or escape from poverty and danger. And they followed other from their communities, just like Germans and Irish did in the 18th centuries, chain migrations. Perplexed governments on each end are uncertain what to do, and immigrants who survived the journey describe the danger and extreme violence that they faced on the way. I have read thousands of European immigrant letters and hundreds of accounts by slave ship survivors, and the parallels are striking. When it comes to immigration, politics, and nativism in America, in many ways, there really is nothing new under the sun. Recent immigrants and descendants in the population are large now, but they've always been, and they were the largest in the 18th century. Most keep coming for freedom and opportunity one way or another, but not all find it, and there is an element of violent coercion for some. The path to America was, has been, is long and dangerous, and still is for many. Nativist fears have not changed since Franklin either. Immigrants can and do depress wages, but they are higher here than they are in the homeland, so they keep coming. And entrepreneurs need their labor and want them to come. Perhaps most importantly, immigrants change America and always have. That aspect of nativist fear is actually true. Language, religion, and other aspects of American culture constantly change, and immigrants have contributed significantly to this, again, since the 18th century. So, are you looking for answers, a plan of action? Good luck. Immigration is a complex, difficult topic and always has been. But at least consider the previous experiences in American history. If you're so inclined, you might attend an immigrant support rally or information meeting like we've been having recently at UUSG. It's always best to stay informed. Decide and do what you will from a position of knowledge instead of ignorance. So how do you talk to nativists about immigration today, if you must? Ask what worries them. Tell them it has always been there. Tell them that illegal immigration has always been a part of the story, including the early Germans who left without permission, and Africans who were smuggled on slave ships after 1808, and others. But this is not a reflection on the character or values of the immigrant, but rather the political systems and those who would exploit them. You should categorically reject the views that associate immigrants with crime. There's always been some criminal element in immigrants. For example, when the British transported convicts to the colonies in the 18th century, about more than 50,000 of them. But crime has always been higher among native-born Americans than it has been among immigrants. And tell them they are right. Immigration will change America. It always has. Generally, however, immigrants are later proud of that change and embarrassed at, Americans are embarrassed at the previous nativist resistance from earlier generations and times. Reject the notion that immigrants threaten America. No one since Franklin has presented a new argument as to how and why this could or would happen, and Franklin changed his mind. I was on the phone talking to my brother yesterday, and this subject came up. I told him I was going to do the sermon here. He said what it's about, so I told him. And he said, well, you know, the Chinese, these draft-age immigrants are lining up to come here because they don't want to get drafted. Well, that sounds like many, many thousands of German immigrants who came in the 19th century to avoid the draft. Yeah, tens of thousands. Yeah. So immigrants have kept coming, and America keeps going. The problems and threats are not new, and neither are the hopes, dreams, and accomplishments of immigrants. America will not go under, at least not because of immigrants. And last, immigrants have always changed America, but they've never destroyed it. Instead, they've helped to make America everything that it is. So thanks for listening.
Visit us at uusg.org.